Hello. Given that the Warhammer world has been around for 40 years and 8 editions, it should perhaps come as no surprise that it's been through many evolutions and changes over that time. There are things that don't exist anymore, things that now exist in a way they didn't previously. And of course, the setting, the geography, and the lore has all changed as well. With a new reboot on the shelves in the form of Warhammer the Old World, it seemed like a good opportunity to take a look at the original world in which Warhammer was set, and it wasn't necessarily quite so old. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the history of the lost continent of Lustria. I imagine that there are many folk who, like me, when asked to imagine the Warhammer world, would naturally default to the old world, a place filled with the Empire and Bretonnia, Estalia, Tylea, Kislev, the World's Edge Mountains, Athol-Loren, and all of the places that surround it. They are very central to my version of the Warhammer world. The plight and the peoples of those areas make up much of the setting and the story in my mind's eye. But that has certainly not always been the case. And for the Warhammer world itself, it didn't start in the old world, more so it started in the new world. It really began in Lustria. Before we get into the origins and evolutions of Lustria, don't forget to consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It absolutely helps the channel. It's so important, and I really appreciate it. And so does this clever girl who is introducing continuity errors left, right, and centre. I should probably also add that this is not a comprehensive history of Lustria. It's such an enormous topic that once I started delving into the research, it really grew arms and legs and snakes and all sorts of jungle creatures. It's just massive, like everything is in the history of this amazing game. So I have had to draw the line in certain arbitrary places. I'm zooming in on certain highlights that I think are super important to that history and just talking about them primarily. Otherwise, this video would be hours and hours long, which would be fun, but I would never finish it. So let's get started with the place to start. In Warhammer's first edition, published in 1983, there was no actual world of Warhammer. The rules were provided more as a toolkit to allow players to use their various RPG and Citadel miniatures in a mass combat game. Much like Dungeons and Dragons that inspired the game and Chainmail before it, the idea was that players would make up whatever world they wanted to play in. It just didn't occur to the creators of Warhammer, Richard Halliwell, Rick Priestley, and Brian Ansell, that players would expect or indeed need a pre-established setting for their games. Even so, in various publications, there would be a sort of world-building exercise, including in the very first edition of Warhammer itself. That box included a scenario written by Hal that was called the Ziggurat of Doom. The scenario, whilst not specifically Lustrian in nature, pitches noble dwarves against ghastly goblins, and there is no wider world in which the Ziggurat of Doom takes place, but we are told about the darkling woods of a place called Dwarf Strangle, and there is an ancient temple that appears to lie at the heart of it. There are only 2 pieces of relatively simple art by Tony Ackland, and not a lot of background information, but I think that these could pass for a jungle setting. There was also another scenario in that first edition box, a little closer to a sandbox of sorts called the Redwake River Valley, which presented a more traditional Tolkien-esque fantasy world, one that would become more dominant as a central feature of the setting. With the release of various leaflets and advertising literature and the regiments of renown, there would be more world building for the Warhammer world as it started to take shape. Much of that would include the European-focused stuff that we'd see in the Redwake River Valley and later Warhammer. But there were mentions here and there of New World-like civilizations and ancient peoples like the Slann. The first Citadel Compendium was released in October 1983, and it introduced two new concepts that would become incredibly important. One was the alienoid amphibians, the Slann, and the other was the place that they lived, Lustria. The Citadel Compendium was part magazine and part catalogue, presenting a host of Citadel-specific info and rules for use by fans. In the first issue, there are catalogue pages showing off plenty of lovely miniature ranges like Lizardmen, monsters, and creepy crawlies. Amongst the rules section, we are treated to a Warhammer scenario, far more detailed than those that we've seen previously. The Legend of Kremlo the Slann tells the story of an orphan Slann baby discovered and adopted by the Norsemen of the village of Skeggy in southern Lustria. When he grows older, Kremlo goes on to inherit the role of chief after some crazed Slann braves attack the village, whilst his father is out lost on the hunt. There is a little bit of information about Slann society, how different tribes are identifiable by the colour of their spines, that they are an ancient and failing civilization, though not as ancient as the elves it specifically mentions, and that their dwindling birth rates have led them to use lobotomized human slaves to make up numbers in their armies. There is also a little bit of lore given about the Norse who have settled on the coast of southern Lustria in the settlement called Skeggy, a name that is shared with one of the dwarves from the Ziggurat of Doom scenario. Lustria itself is established as being home to impenetrable jungle, Slann spawning pools, and stepped pyramid temples, and dangerous swamps. According to Rick Priestley, Kremlo the Slann was originally going to be called Kremlo the Croxigor, which he described as Hal's original name for the demon Aztec frogs from outer space. The scenario itself still embodies the role-playing roots of the Warhammer game, as players are expected to take on the roles of key characters with their own motivations and power plays. With the Norse tribal leader dead, Kremlo the Slann has become chief by default, and the biological sons of his adopted father are not best pleased about it. Over the course of several battles across Skeggy and the Slann settlement of Zapotek, the untrustworthy sons can actually win by somehow engineering Kremlo's death, just as long as none of the tribesfolk witness it. It's a surprisingly complex set of objectives, in what you might have thought would be just a straightforward wargame scenario. There are even special rules for characters who might be alcoholics. This is not just wargame, it's absolutely wargame and roleplay game in one. Even with those interesting rules and characters in that scenario, it still wasn't clear what the wider version of Lustria looked like, and in the second Citadel Compendium in 1984, there was a far clearer explanation of exactly how important Lustria was going to be for the development of Warhammer. The creation of Richard Halliwell, southern Lustria is a fantasy continent whose geography and history to some extent parallel that of South America. However, in the strange and bewildering imagination of its strange and bewildering author, the Native Americans and usurping conquistadors are supplanted by the weird amphibian Slann and the wild and adventurous Old Worlders, including the Norsemen, Sea Elves, and Dwarves. And it's with this issue that we get to see the first fruits from Hal's work on this bewilderingly strange continent of Lustria, with a scenario called Rigg's Shrine. The Great Shrine stands on the shore Lake Locker, deep in the forests of Amazonia. It is said to commemorate the mythic union between Rig, Amazon goddess of war, and Amex, the sea elf god of wealth and happiness. Much like the scenarios we've already seen, this one is presented with more of a sandbox of opportunity for the players. There's everything from the shrine itself to the Amazonian warriors who worship at and protect it, the culture, religion, and history of those Amazons. And there are plenty of punny names and jokes all throughout that would become a staple of Warhammer and Lustria in particular. For example, there is a section on the coca drug-addicted religious zealots who devote their entire lives to this narcotic. They are known as the Coca Colim. The shrine itself is presented as a dungeon complex with floor plans, room descriptions, and encounter tables. There is no specific objective provided, simply information on what might happen if there were an attempted burglary or a raid on the shrine, and how that might be different if it's done at day or night. There are also details about the potential spoils for raiders, the high-age technology that was created by the Slann and is now possessed by the Amazons, things like needlers, power swords, and bolt pistols. The Amazons themselves would not stick around in the Warhammer world for long. They are still mentioned in places such as the 3rd edition rulebook, but they would not receive an army list, and miniatures soon faded from view. Though fortunately, Blood Bowl has long had an Amazonian presence. The idea of a race of powerful, matriarchal women in the Warhammer world is, I think, a pretty fun one, and I think it's a shame that they didn't stick around longer. There are echoes and sort of almost influences from the Amazons in many other games and bits of lore in Warhammer and Games Workshop history, particularly the Eschers from Necromunda, I think. But there was an opportunity there that I think it's a shame didn't get followed through on, to explore how the Amazons might have been relevant to a wider Warhammer world and story. There was another line in the introduction to the scenario Rig Shrine that's worth mentioning as well. More new adventures in southern Lustria will form a future Warhammer supplement, inviting players to further mayhem and misdeed in a complete and challenging game setting. During the early years of Citadel and Games Workshop, there would be loads of teases just like this one, talking about products, games, supplements, all kinds of stuff that would just never get released. Unfortunately, Hal's Lustria book was one of them, but this would not be the last time we would hear about it. In fact, in the spring 1985 Citadel Journal, an irregular magazine that's served a very similar function to the compendium, there was something in the news items that put an interesting spin on the development of this product. Richard Halliwell has almost completed his script for Lustria, a complete role-playing continent for Warhammer. From what we've already seen, Lustria is shaping up to be an invaluable playing aid, with full descriptions of the cities, lands, and peoples of Lustria. Complete city maps are given, together with building plans for houses, temples, fortresses, and other buildings of this land. So this was an interesting news item that didn't come too long after the previous one, but things had changed slightly. Hal, who had been working on the first draft of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, was now developing the Lustria book as a Woofrup supplement. It was going to be one of, if not the first supplement for the role-playing game when it was released. And that's probably not too surprising given what we've seen in the scenarios so far. The wargame and the role-playing game shared a lot of DNA, so perhaps it's not any surprise that this book was going to move from one to the other. In 1984, the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle Rules was released, and with it, we would get some more Lustrian goodness. There is a scenario in the box that follows a dwarf hero, or rather dwarf layabout, called Sven Hasselfresian, and the motley crew of his ship, the Volkswagen, as they attempt to protect a Norse settlement from the predations of the Slann raiders led by Gurgle Greenwake. There is a new map of a Lustrian locale, featuring more jungle and another stepped pyramid. Plus, you can also get to see what a Warhammer Volkswagen would actually look like. The campaign pack, Bloodbath at Orc's Drift, would place its action in the northern part of the New World, an area that was already becoming closely associated with the Dark Elves, but which was connected to Lustria, North America to Lustria's south. In comments on Facebook, sourced by the Awesome Lies blog, Rick Priestley reflected on why the long-gestating Hal Lustrian supplement never made it to release. Things changed very rapidly in the early 80s, and sometimes projects got put aside when something else came along, as happened with Realm of Chaos too. Hal also didn't work for GW consistently. He would work for a while, and then go off around the world for a while, especially at that time. He took a motorbike down the Pan American Highway, and a lot of the inspiration for Lustria came from that trip. I think it's fair to say that it might have included some fantastic gags. The third edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles would provide a comprehensive core rulebook that would be way more detailed about every corner of the Warhammer world than we'd ever seen before. It had army lists, faction details, a bestiary, and a map that would draw out details about different aspects of the Warhammer world, including Lustria, which was still present, but which was described as being a little bit different to the rest of the game's world. The continent of Lustria evolved from the campaigns of Warhammer author Richard Halliwell. Lustria is the strangest of all our Warhammer settings, featuring the fallen civilization of the Slann, its ancient scientific ruins in the jungles, and an unusual blend of demonism and technology. Into this world of Aztec dreams are thrust the adventuring Old Worlders and Norse, freebooters, treasure seekers, and settlers with little respect for the philosophical treasures of an ancient civilization. The Slann also feature in the bestiary section of the book, and their history as a spacefaring nation is explicitly detailed. It's interesting. The Slann are an ancient race whose past and origin stretches beyond the horizon of this world. Once they roamed the stuff of chaos in their marvelous silver spaceships, seeding the universe with their genetic experiments. Today, the long isolated remnants of those Slann who settled on the Warhammer world live in Lustria. During the 3rd edition of Warhammer, it was much more closely associated with Warhammer 40,000, and it's entirely possible that the Slann here are the actual old ones of 40k. Either way, there would be more mentions of the Slann's spacefaring technology here and there, such as in one of the short stories in Warhammer's first fiction anthology, written by Stephen Baxter. Ahead of the release of the Warhammer Armies book, a supplement for the 3rd edition that would detail armies lists for all of the factions in the game, there would be a couple of White Dwarf articles that would deal with Lustria and its peoples. One of them is great, and one of them is not so great. In White Dwarf 96, the Slann marched to battle with a mercenary army list, presented in an article called Slann War. It's always fun to pun. But then there is White Dwarf issue 100, which featured a Wolfrup scenario built around the Pygmies, a race of short-statured humanoids native to Lustria. There are mentions of the Pygmies in many different places around this time, including in Warhammer's 3rd edition core rulebook, but it's in this scenario that we get the clearest picture of them, and it's an unfortunate one. The Floating Gardens of Barb Elon was designed as a convention game for the 1987 Games Day, and it sees players take on the roles of a party of pygmies. The lore, art, and miniature range that was created to depict the pygmies is undeniably problematic, drawing on negative racial stereotypes and caricatures. Thankfully, the pygmies did not stick around for long in the Warhammer world. By the end of 3rd edition, they were more or less completely gone. I think it's a shame that we lost the Amazons. There was a potential there to explore a really interesting faction. With the Pygmies, I am not sad about it at all. In my opinion, they offered no value to the Warhammer world, and it really was better off without them. With only fleeting appearances in the Warhammer Armies book, it seemed that the focus on Lustria began to wane as the 3rd edition of Warhammer wore on. The various campaign packs for the 2nd edition had moved away from Lustria and towards the Old World, and much of the story seemed to centre now on the Old World itself, and the people of the nations that were based there. The Lustria supplement was very much a passion project of Hal's, having originated in his games of Warhammer. It was something that he worked on in the background when he wasn't developing amazing games like Space Hulk, Dark Future, and Warhammer Fantasy itself. When he left the company in the early 90s, it didn't quite disappear, but its importance seemed to fade. Flame Publications, the subsidiary that was responsible for Wolfrup, was what took on the continued development of the Lustria project, and Carl Sargent was in charge. Sargent was one of the creative minds behind the Enemy Within campaign, and plenty of other 1st edition Wolfrup content, and with Tony Ackland, he was responsible for driving Flame Publications forward. It's not clear how much Sargent revised Hal's manuscript for Lustria, but we do know that art was created for the book as well, such as these pieces by Stephen Hardy. Hardy was in fact commissioned by Sargent to produce as much as 50% of the internal art for the upcoming sourcebook, which was now called Lustrian Adventures. On his wonderful blog, The Shire and Everything After, Hardy has actually published some of the long-lost manuscript that he was sent to illustrate, some 30 years after the project had originally been cancelled. These pages were from the actual Woof-Rup supplement that Hal had first started working on, a project that began alongside his work on the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and they were now, finally, available to the public. In its pages, you can find information about the various tribes and settlements of the Slann, the hierarchies and politics of their civilization, their history, and the other creatures that lived in the jungles of Lustria. It's remarkable to think that this book, which was almost complete, which was written by one of the great creators of Warhammer, Richard Halliwell, just never made it to publication. In an interview with the always incredible Awesome Lies blog, Stephen Hardy reflected on the end of the project. Carl was always clear that Flame were pushing this to go ahead, but it might not happen. So when the word came down that GW had pulled the plug, I was obviously disappointed, but not surprised. My guess is, based on what happened in the years after that GW were planning to take Lustria in a new direction, Lizardmen and Skinks, and the supplement would have entrenched the old ideas. I don't think we'll particularly miss the highly suspect pygmies, but I've always felt GW lost something when they ditched the Slann, or rather amended them to what they are today. In my view, the Slann were a genuinely unique and interesting creation of GW. I guess they were lost when GW broke the links between Fantasy and 40k, as the Slann crossed into both games. I've included links below to Stephen Hardy's The Shire and Everything After blog, which is full of some really wonderful hobby content, and the Awesome Lies blog, which features just the best writing you will find on the internet about the history of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's truly incredible. It's been an absolutely essential resource in this video and many of my other videos. I fully recommend it, so go and check it out. The Lustrian Adventures sourcebook appears to have been lost alongside the rest of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay when Flame Publications was shut down in the early 90s. A management buyout had lumbered Games Workshop with a huge amount of debt, and anything that was not core to the business, like RPGs, was cut. So where did that leave Lustria in the Warhammer battle game? Well, 4th edition was right around the corner. The 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles rationalised the setting almost as drastically as the buyout had reshaped the company. Armies were refocused and made more accessible for a wider audience. Rules for factions like the Slann and the Bretonnians were, if not always totally removed, then scaled back in prominence. The new dedicated Warhammer Armies books didn't touch on either of those factions. The 4th edition Battle Bestiary included no specifically Lustrian armies either, but the continent remains in place on the world's map, and is mentioned several times in the world building of the book. The map itself clearly declares the strong focus of the setting has shifted from this point on. It really is about the old world now, and even the lore for Lustria is explained in relation to the old world nations. Even today, it is only the brave and adventurous that travel to the lands known as Lustria to explore the treasure-packed ruins of that land. The discovery of Lustria has been made, but its exploration and study has only just begun. With the discovery of a route into the south, the men of the old world have begun to map the coasts of the Southlands and Lustria, although to date they have discovered nothing but jungle and savage natives. Of course, Lustria would return to the game in a pretty major way, with the release of the 5th edition core box. That would feature Bretonnians versus a Lustrian-specific army, the Lizardmen. The core box included units of Saurus warriors and Skink archers, and the Lizardmen were positioned as a major force in the Warhammer world, emerging from their jungle homeland of Lustria. The Lizardmen had been in the Warhammer range since more or less the beginning, though in earlier iterations, they were often as populous and geographically widespread as goblins or orcs, found in the tunnels beneath ruined fortresses and abandoned temples the world over. Now though, things were different. The Slann retained their frog-like appearance, but the lore for the ancient race leaned even further into their fate as a fading civilization. The few remaining Slann are still mighty magic users, but their people are all but extinct, and those that are left are desperately trying to enact the all but lost great plan of the Old Ones. There is no spacefaring technology, and the Slann warriors are all gone, but there are still spawning pools and great step temples, and from these emerge the Saurus and the Skinks, the so-called Lizardmen. These are now the foot soldiers of the Slann, and the rightful inhabitants of Lustria. Just as Kremlo the Slann had been known as Kremlo the Kroxigor in one of Hal's unpublished drafts, the unpublished Lustrian adventure sourcebook also included references to Lizardmen and Kroxigors in Lustria, so it seems that many of the 5th edition ideas for Warhammer armies actually predated the release of the Lizardmen book. But it was here that those ideas were forged into a modern version of the army, and their homeland was given a consistent foundation from which it would now evolve. There are still plenty of aspects of Hal's original vision of Lustria as a reimagined South America, and one particularly good example of this is in Mike McVeigh's beautiful diorama that depicts the attempts of would-be conquistadors as they find themselves in trouble in the new world while they encounter the Lizardmen who call it home. From here on out, the Lustria that's presented in Warhammer's releases is very similar to the Lustria that we're familiar with today. There aren't any major reboots or reshapings of the world still to come. Mostly. There would be additions to the lore of Lustria though, like the mention of the vampire pirate Luther Harkon and the Vampire Coast. A global campaign would pit the Lizardmen against the Bretonnians on a quest to recover ancient looted artifacts and to protect their X-Files inspired dark conspiracy. In the 6th edition, there was a dedicated Lustria campaign book, the first of a proposed series of regional guides for Warhammer that offered scenarios, terrain, campaigns, and gameplay options specifically tied to the environment of Lustria. The Skaven of Clan Pestilence became major players in the Lustrian continent and would have many stories that take place there. The Warhammer world continued to develop in White Dwarf and on the tabletop and in armies books and other expansions right the way up to late in the 8th edition of the game in 2015, when, for reasons, everything came to an untimely end. So there had been a campaign book based on Lustria for Warhammer Fantasy Battles, perhaps something similar to what Hal had originally envisaged, but I suspect not. His Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay supplement was all about creating the continent of Lustria as a backdrop for adventure, and that was something that we just didn't receive during the 8 editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and we didn't get at all until recently. In 2023, Cubicle 7 released a dedicated Lustrian sourcebook that thoroughly explored the continent, presenting sites of interest, flora, fauna, the history and people and places of the Lizardmen, the Norse, the Skaven, and the elves who lived there. Plus, there was a whole host of other stuff in there as well. I have already reviewed the book here on the channel, and of course, it is going to be very different to what Hal originally intended. But it is a dedicated book about Lustria for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and I was very content with the content about the continent. Lustria was so central to the early world building of Warhammer, driven largely by Richard Halliwell's fascination with the ideas behind this place. It seems that it was always a very idiosyncratic setting, one that other designers and storytellers for the game didn't necessarily have as strong a connection with. It's unsurprising that with Hal gone, Lustria was also lost. At least until the concerted effort of the 5th edition found a way to make a Lustria that made sense in the Warhammer world which had emerged over the intervening years. And from there, the work of countless background and rules writers has made a Lustria that feels as integral to the history and lore of the Warhammer world as any other part of it. That the old world returned sans Lustria is a minor shame, as it would have been great to explore that part of the Warhammer world through a new lens in a modern version of the game. But who knows, perhaps we will get the opportunity to explore it in a future supplement for that game. At the very least, despite promising it for the better part of 40 years and not delivering on it, there is now, finally, a version of Lustria that we can play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in and to explore to our heart's content. I hope that you've enjoyed this relatively brief exploration of Lustria and its part in the history of Warhammer. It's a place that has always been there, but has evolved in different ways and meant different things to different versions of the game over the years. I should thank once again the Awesome Lies blog. It's a fantastic resource and I definitely recommend you check it out. I've put a link in the description below. You will also find links to my Discord and my Patreon in the description below. If you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, please consider checking those out because it's a huge help. The history videos, the interviews, I can only do all of this with your support. And whether that is joining the Patreon or just sharing my videos, liking, commenting, and subscribing, it's all greatly appreciated and really, really important. So thank you so much. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Honestly, The Starboat by Steve Baxter is one of the weirdest stories you will ever read in Warhammer fiction. It's in Ignorant Armies. It features a man who goes undercover as a Slann. It's really wild. Only read it if you want to expose your mind to the secrets of chaos.